The Americans, Chapter 12, Reconstruction and its Effects.
Section 3, The Collapse of Reconstruction. In 1868, white Georgia legislators, who were in the majority in both houses, expelled 27 black members of the state Senate and House of Representatives. The new state constitution gave African Americans the right to vote, they argued, but not to hold office. Outraged by this expulsion, Henry M. Turner, an African American legislator, addressed the Georgia House of Representatives. Here's a quote from The Trouble They Seen, Black People Tell the Story of Reconstruction. Whose legislature is this? Is it a white man's legislature, or is it a black man's? It is said that Congress never gave us the right to hold office. I want to know if the Reconstruction measures did not base their action on the ground that no distinction should be made on account of race, color, or previous condition. We have built up your country. We have worked in your fields and garnered your harvests for 250 years. Do we ask you for the compensation? We are willing to let the dead past bury its dead, but we ask you now for our rights. End quote. The expelled legislators petitioned the U.S. Congress and were eventually reinstated in office, but by the time Congress acted, more than a year later, the terms of Turner and his colleagues were almost at an end. White Southerners who took the direct action against African American participation in government were in the minority. Most white Southerners swallowed whatever resentment they felt over African Americans' changing status. However, some bitter Southern whites relied on violence to keep African Americans from participating in politics. Founded as a social club for Confederate veterans, the Ku Klux Klan started in Tennessee in 1866. As membership in the group spread rapidly through the South, many of the new chapters turned into violent terrorist organizations. By 1868, the Klan existed in practically every Southern state. Its overreaching goal was to restore white supremacy. Its method was to prevent African Americans from exercising their political rights. Between 1868 and 1871, the Klan and other secret groups killed thousands of men, women, and children and burned schools, churches, and property. Abraham Colby, who organized a branch of Georgia's Equal Rights Association and later served as a Republican member of the Georgia legislature, testified before Congress about Klan atrocities. Quote, "The Klan broke my door open, took me out of my bed, took me to the woods and whipped me 3 hours or more and left me for dead. They said to me, 'Do you think you will ever vote another damned radical ticket?' I supposed they would kill me anyhow. I said, if there was an election tomorrow, I would vote the radical ticket. They set in and whipped me 1,000 licks more, and with sticks and straps that had buckles on the ends of them." End quote. This is testimony taken by the Joint Select Committee inquiry into the condition of affairs in the late insurrectionary states. While the vast majority of the Klan's victims were African Americans, whites who tried to help African Americans, whether by educating them, renting land to them, or buying their crops, were also in danger. Another Klan objective was to turn the Republicans who had established the Reconstruction governments out of power. The North Carolina State Senator John Stevens, a white Republican, answered warnings that his life was in danger by saying that some 3,000 African American voters had supported him, quote, "at the risk of persecution and starvation," end quote, and that he would not abandon them. Stevens was assassinated in 1870. While Klan members tried to conceal their identities when they struck, Southern Democrats openly used violence to intimidate Republicans before the 1875 state election in Mississippi. Democrats rioted and attacked Republican leaders and prominent African Americans. Their terrorist campaign frightened the African American majority away from the polls, and white Democratic candidates swept the election. The Democrats used similar tactics to win the 1876 elections in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. The Klan and other secret groups tried to prevent African Americans from making economic as well as political progress. African Americans who owned their own land or who worked in occupations other than agriculture were subject to attacks and destruction of property. In fact, economic necessity forced most former slaves who had little money or training in other occupations to work for whites as wage laborers or sharecroppers. Some white Southerners refused to hire or do business with African Americans who were revealed by election officials to have voted Republican. The fear of economic reprisals kept many former slaves from voting at all. To curtail the Klan violence and Democratic intimidation, Congress passed a series of enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871. One act provided for the federal supervision of elections in southern states. Another act gave the president the power to use federal troops in areas where the Klan was active. However, President Grant was not aggressive in his use of the power given to him by the enforcement acts. And in 1882, the Supreme Court ruled that the 1871 Enforcement Act was unconstitutional. Although federal enforcement of anti-Klan legislation was limited, it did contribute to a decrease in the Klan's activities in the late 1870s. However, the reason for the reduction in Klan violence was the Klan's own success. By 1880, terrorist groups had managed to restore white supremacy throughout the South. The Klan no longer needed such organized activities to limit the political and civil rights of most African Americans. By passing the enforcement acts, Congress seemed to shore up Republican power, but shortly after these acts went into effect, Congress passed legislation that severely weakened the Republican Party in the South. With the Amnesty Act passed in 1872, Congress returned the right to vote and the right to hold federal and state offices, revoked by the 14th Amendment, to about 150,000 former Confederates who would almost certainly vote Democratic. In the same year, Congress allowed the Freedmen's Bureau to expire, believing that it had fulfilled its purpose. As a result of these actions, Southern Democrats had an opportunity to shift the balance of political power in their favor. As Southern Republicans struggled to maintain their hold on Reconstruction governments, widespread political corruption in the federal government weakened their party. During the 1870s, scandals plagued the Grant administration. These scandals diverted public attention away from conditions in the South. President Grant was considered an honest man. However, he had no political experience before becoming president and found it difficult to believe that others might use him for their own political advantage. When making political appointments, he often selected friends and acquaintances rather than people of proven ability. Too frequently, Grant's appointees turned out to be dishonest. Beginning in 1872, a series of long simmering scandals associated with Grant's administration boiled over. First, a newspaper exposed how the Credit Mobilier, a construction company working for the Union Pacific Railroad, had skimmed off large profits from the railroad's government contract. Implicated were several top Republicans, including Vice President Schuyler Colfax. A group of Republicans, angered by the corruption, called for an honest, efficient government. They formed the Liberal Republican Party in 1872, hoping to oust Grant in that year's presidential election. As the 1872 presidential election approached, the Liberal Republicans held a separate convention. They chose Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, and a vocal pre-Civil War abolitionist as their candidate. He had supported some radical Republican causes, abolition and the 14th and 15th Amendments. However, he had broken with radicals by calling for universal amnesty for Confederates and for an end to military rule in the South. Claiming that Reconstruction governments had achieved their purpose, he wanted former slaves to fend for themselves. Believing that it would take a united effort to oust Grant, the Democrats also nominated Greeley. Nevertheless, Greeley lost the 1872 presidential election to Grant by a wide margin. Quote, "I was the worst beaten man that ever ran for that high office," end quote, Greeley said, quote, "and I have been assailed so bitterly that I hardly know whether I was running for president or the penitentiary. End quote. Physically exhausted by his rigorous campaign, Greeley died a few weeks after the election, before the Electoral College made his defeat official. Although the liberal Republicans did not win the White House, they did weaken the radicals' hold over the Republican Party. The breakdown of Republican unity made it even harder for the radicals to continue to impose their Reconstruction plan on the South. Despite the rift in the Republican Party that resulted from the scandals, corruption in Grant's administration continued. In 1875, the so-called whiskey ring was exposed. Internal Revenue collectors and other officials accepted bribes from whiskey distillers who wanted to avoid paying taxes on their product, a conspiracy that defrauded the federal government of millions of dollars. One of the 238 persons indicted in this scandal was Grant's private secretary, General Orville E. Babcock. Grant refused to believe that such a close associate was guilty and helped him escape conviction. Finally, in 1876, an investigation revealed that Secretary of War William W. Belknap had accepted bribes from merchants who wanted to keep their profitable trading concessions in Indian Territory. The House of Representatives impeached Belknap, who promptly resigned. The public also learned that the Secretary of the Navy had taken bribes from shipbuilders, and the Secretary of the Interior had had shady dealings with land speculators. As the evidence mounted, there was increasing disgust with the blatant corruption in the Grant administration, and Grant did not seek re-election in 1876. As if political scandals were not enough for the country to deal with, a wave of economic troubles hit the nation in 1873. The economy had been expanding since the end of the Civil War, and investors became convinced that business profits would continue to increase indefinitely. Eager to take advantage of new business opportunities in the South, northern and southern investors borrowed increasing amounts of money and built new facilities as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, many of those who invested in these new businesses took on more debt than they could afford. A Philadelphia banker named J. Cook invested heavily in railroads. Not enough investors bought shares in Cook's railroad lines to cover his ballooning construction costs, and he could not pay his debts. In September 1873, Cook's banking firm, the nation's largest dealer in government securities, went bankrupt, setting off a series of financial failures known as the Panic of 1873. Smaller banks closed, and the stock market temporarily collapsed. Within a year, 89 railroads went broke. By 1875, more than 18,000 companies had folded. The panic triggered a 5-year economic depression, a period of reduced business activity and high unemployment in which 3 million workers lost their jobs. The economic depression following the Panic of 1873 also fueled a dispute over currency. This dispute had its roots in the Civil War. During the war, the federal government had begun to issue greenbacks, paper money that was not backed by equal value in gold. When the war ended, many financial experts advocated withdrawing the greenbacks and returning the nation completely to a currency backed by gold. This action would have reduced the number of dollars in circulation. In contrast, southern and western farmers and manufacturers wanted the government to issue even more greenbacks. They believed that easy money, a large money supply, could help them pay off their debts. In 1875, Congress passed the Specie Resumption Act, which promised to put the country back on the gold standard. This act sparked further debate over monetary policies. As the economy improved, beginning in 1878, the controversy died down. However, the passionate debate over the money question in the 1870s was one of the many factors that drew the attention of voters and politicians away from Reconstruction. In 1874, a Southern Democratic senator wrote, quote, "Radicalism is dissolving, going to pieces," end quote. Indeed, political scandals, economic problems, and the restoration of political rights to former Confederate Democrats seriously weakened the radical Republicans. In addition, the Supreme Court began to undo some of the social and political changes that the radicals had made. Although Congress had passed important laws to protect the political and civil rights of African Americans, the Supreme Court began to take away those same protections. During the 1870s, the court issued a series of decisions that undermined both the 14th and 15th Amendment. In the Slaughterhouse case of 1873, for example, the court decided that the 14th Amendment protected only the rights people had by virtue of their citizenship in the United States, such as the right of interstate travel and the right to federal protection when traveling on the high seas and abroad. The court contended that most of Americans' basic civil rights were obtained through their citizenship in a state, and that the amendment did not protect those rights. Another setback for Reconstruction was U.S. versus Cruikshank in 1876, in which the court ruled that the 14th Amendment did not give the federal government the right to punish individual whites who oppressed blacks. The same year, in U.S. versus Reese, the court ruled in favor of officials who had barred African Americans from voting, stating that the 15th Amendment did not, quote, confer the right of suffrage on anyone, end quote, but merely listed grounds on which states could not deny suffrage. By the late 1870s, the Supreme Court's restrictive rulings had narrowed the scope of these amendments so much that the federal government no longer had much power to protect the rights of African Americans. Although the Supreme Court would later overturn them, these decisions impeded African Americans' efforts to gain equality for years to come. As the Supreme Court rejected Reconstruction policies in the 1870s, Northern voters grew indifferent to events in the South. Weary of the, quote, Negro question, end quote, and sick of, quote, carpetbag government, end quote, many Northerners voters shifted their attention to such national concerns as the Panic of 1873 and the corruption in Grant's administration. In addition, a desire for reconciliation between the regions spread through the North. Although political violence continued in the South, the African Americans were denied civil and political rights. The tide of public opinion in the North began to turn against the Reconstruction policies. As both judicial and public support decreased, Republicans began to back away from their commitment to Reconstruction. The impassioned radicals who had led the fight for congressional Reconstruction, Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, were dead. Business interests diverted the attention of both moderates and radicals, and scalawags and carpetbaggers deserted the Republican Party. Moreover, Republicans gradually came to believe that government could not impose the moral and social changes needed for former slaves to make progress in the South. As a result, Republicans slowly retreated from the policies of Reconstruction. Between 1869 and 1875, Democrats recaptured the state governments of Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. As a result of redemption, as the Democrats called their return to power in the South, and the national election of 1876, congressional Reconstruction came to an end. In 1876, Grant decided not to run for a third term. The Republicans then chose the stodgy governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, as their candidate. Smelling victory, the Democrats put up their own ablest leaders, Governor Samuel J. Tilden of New York. Tilden had helped clean up the graft that had flourished in New York City under the corrupt Tweed ring. As most people had expected, Tilden won the popular vote. However, he fell one short of the number of electoral votes needed to win, and 20 electoral votes were disputed. Congress appointed a commission to deal with the problem. The commission, which had a Republican majority, gave the election to the Republican Hayes, even though he had received a minority of the popular vote. For the first time in U.S. history, a candidate who had lost the popular election became president. How did it happen? In the oldest tradition of politics, party leaders made a deal. Although Republicans controlled the Electoral Commission, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, which had to approve the election results. Southern Democrats were willing to accept Hayes if they could get something in return. The price they demanded was, first of all, the withdrawal of federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina, two of the three southern states that Republicans still governed. Second, the Democrats wanted federal money to build a railroad from Texas to the West Coast and to improve southern rivers, harbors, and bridges. Third, they wanted Hayes to appoint a conservative Southerner to the cabinet. In the Compromise of 1877, Republican leaders agreed to these demands, and Hayes was peacefully inaugurated. The acceptance of this compromise meant the end of Reconstruction in the South. After the 1876 election, Republicans and Democrats disputed the results in Louisiana's and South Carolina's elections, and both states ended up with two rival state governments. When Hayes later removed the federal troops in those states, the Democrats took over. Florida also had questionable election returns, but the state Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Democrats. As a result, Republicans no longer controlled the government of any southern state. The Democrats had achieved their long-desired goal of home rule, the ability to run state government without federal intervention. These so-called redeemers set out to rescue the South from what they viewed as a decade of mismanagement by Northerners, Republicans, and African Americans. They passed laws that restricted the rights of African Americans, wiped out social programs, slashed taxes, and dismantled public schools. Despite the efforts of African Americans and many radical Republicans, Reconstruction ended without much real progress in the battle against discrimination. Charles Harris, an African American Union Army veteran and former Alabama legislator, expressed his frustration in an 1877 letter. Quote, We obey laws, others make them. We support state educational institutions whose doors are virtually closed against us. We support asylums and hospitals, and our sick, deaf, dumb, or blind are met at the doors by unjust discriminations. From these and many other oppressions, our people long to be free. Quoted in American Colonization Society papers in the Congressional Record. Although radical Republicans wanted to help the former slaves, they made several serious mistakes. First, they assumed that extending certain civil rights to freed persons would enable them to protect themselves through participation in government, especially in lawmaking. However, Congress did not adequately protect those rights, and the Supreme Court undermined them. Second, the radicals balked at distributing land to former slaves, which prevented them from becoming economically independent of the landowning planter class. Finally, the radicals did not fully realize the extent to which the deep-seated racism in society would weaken the changes that Congress had tried to make. But congressional Reconstruction was not a complete failure. The 13th Amendment permanently abolished slavery in all of the states. Furthermore, radical Republicans did succeed in passing the 14th and 15th Amendments, and although the Supreme Court narrowed the interpretation of the amendments during the 1870s, they remained part of the Constitution. In the 20th century, the amendments provided the necessary constitutional foundation for important civil rights legislation. During Reconstruction, African Americans had founded many black colleges and volunteer organizations, and the percentage of literate African Americans had gradually increased. The memory of this time of expanding opportunities lived on in the African American community and inspired the fight to regain civil rights.